You should ask for feedback. When people ask for it, the feedback process goes down. We all hate it, but it's important.
Welcome to a new episode of The Blunt Dollar. Sébastien Page is here with us today. He's the head of Global Multi-Asset and Chief Investment Officer at Rowe Price, overseeing more than $500 billion in assets. He's also an award-winning researcher, CFA charter holder, and the author of multiple books, including his latest, The Psychology of Leadership.
81% of Americans, they want to write a book at some point in their lifetime. And when I was writing, it was a journey for me to improve myself as a leader. Embracing stress is a superpower. Optimal performance does not happen at zero stress. It requires a certain level of stress and activation. In fact, if you were never stressed or never anxious about anything, you would not perform as well as you do. If you learn to manage it, you can drive your performance higher, your team's performance higher as well.
This is The Blunt Dollar with Ignacio Ramirez. Quick disclaimer, the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the speakers and do not constitute financial investment or legal advice. This content is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a substitute for professional advice. Always do your own research and consult a qualified advisor before making any financial decisions. All investments involve risk, including the potential loss of capital. And now, let's get started with the episode. Hello everyone and welcome to a new episode of The Blunt Dollar. Today, I have the huge privilege of sitting down with someone who knows both sides of the game, how to manage billions and how to manage people. Sébastien Page is here with us today. He's the head of Global Multi-Asset and Chief Investment Officer at Rowe Price, overseeing more than $500 billion in assets. He's also an award-winning researcher, a CFA charter holder, and the author of multiple books, including his latest, The Psychology of Leadership. In this episode, we're diving into a topic that's often overlooked in finance, which is how leadership, psychology, and even sports performance shape the way we think about investing, resilience, and decision-making. Why do measurable goals sometimes backfire? How can we rethink success? And what does being disagreeable have to do with being a great leader? Sébastien has some fascinating takes in all these questions, and I can't wait to unpack them with him. So whether you're a portfolio manager, a startup founder, or just someone looking to level up your leadership game, this episode is for you. Sébastien, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ignacio. I'm fired up. I love doing podcasts because we have
Awesome.
a little bit more time to talk. I just love the format.
And you're such a natural. For those of you, by the way, that are not following Sébastien already, please make sure to check him out in socials, particularly LinkedIn, because he's sharing content on a daily basis pretty much, and it's very, very high quality.
And you too. You share great content too, Ignacio.
Yeah, I'm trying to learn from the best here, you know? So before we get started, tell us a little bit about you. What is it that you're doing exactly nowadays?
So I'm head of the Global Multi-Asset Division at Rowe Price, and I'm Chief Investment Officer for the firm. I oversee a team of investment professionals, and I represent the firm. And as a member of the management committee, I help our CEO run the entire firm as well. Rowe Price, we have over 7,000 employees, 1.6 trillion in assets under management, and we're in over 20 countries. So busy times these days with markets, as you might expect, Ignacio. It requires a lot of resilience.
100%. Although we're not going to be talking about markets today, you know a lot of stuff about them, but today we're going to be focusing on a completely different topic on which you're also an expert, which is the psychology behind leadership and investing. And of course, we're going to be talking about your book. And I'd like to start with that because finance is an industry driven by numbers, performance metrics, data. However, some of the most successful investors and leaders really can recognize that psychology, so the way we make decisions and we manage stress, is just as crucial as technical skills. And I wanted to ask you, what inspired you to write this book about the psychology of leadership, and what is it that you're talking about in it?
Well, I was struggling a little bit at work, And I just wanted to become a better leader myself. So in the intro of the book, I say to my readers, you're reading this book for self-improvement. I wrote it for the same reason. And let me tell you, Ignacio, nowadays, you don't write a nonfiction book for money. That was not the motivation. And I can tell you, I looked into it and I don't really believe the numbers. And I don't know if there are good numbers on this. But if I were to ask you, Ignacio, how many nonfiction English language books are published per year, you think?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I have absolutely no idea.
It's a crazy number. The lowest estimate I've seen is 500,000. And I've seen estimates of 1 million books published every year.
Per year.
It's a tough business. Thank you for getting me on your webcast to talk about the book. 81% of Americans in a survey responded that they want to write a book at some point in their lifetime. So
Wow.
I really genuinely think the book will help a lot of people. I'm not doing this for the money. And when I was writing, it was a journey for me to improve myself as a leader. So that was the inspiration.
Well, that's a great inspiration, I would say. And hopefully we can get you a few purchases with this episode. You for sure have one over here. There's going to place an order. So I know that one of the things you talk about very often is the intersection between sports psychology and finance. In recent years, top finance professionals have turned to sports psychology to enhance their performance. And they've looked at things ranging from mental resilience to decision-making under pressure. So I wanted to ask you, what are the links between sports psychology and finance, and how can investors and leaders apply these principles to improve decision-making?
It's fascinating how closely related sports psychology is with the psychology of money management. Think about it. In sports, you control your process, but you don't have full control over the outcome. You don't control the weather, what your opponent is going to do, whatever sport you play. There's a luck component, just like in money management. And what you need is a little edge that you can replicate over time, just like in money management. You need to focus on your process and understand the difference between luck and skill. And you know, what's remarkably similar is both disciplines, money management or sports, entail a lot of losing, Ignacio. There's a lot of losing. And so sports psychology is fascinating because it's actually about losing more than winning. Winning is fine, it's great. But losing is the opportunity to learn and grow. Doesn't that sound similar to investment management, where you make a bad decision, you have a bad outcome? Did I follow my process? And was I just unlucky? Or, which is much harder, was I lucky on a decision that didn't follow my process and necessarily wasn't really good? I put all my portfolio in crypto and it went up 100% in 2 months. That's, you got lucky maybe. And I'm not bashing crypto whatsoever. I'm just saying like it's a pretty concentrated position if you're, say, saving for retirement. So many things are the same. And I'll just say this about sports psychology. It's all the rage right now. And if you go back to 2012, Ignacio, I have this story in the book. It's in the intro about Felix Baumgartner. Have you heard the name? Like he's actually done something amazing in 2012. He went up on a balloon 24 miles up to the edge of space. Remember that?
The Red Bull sponsored? Yeah. I remember now.
He skydived. He had a special suit, but he skydived from space and reached 840 miles per hour. First person to do that. Great story, right? He was actually trained the whole time by a sports psychologist. And if you look into it, you'll find that all the pro sports teams now have a sports psychologist on staff. The statistic is something like 80% of them use a sports psychologist, as to the Major League Baseball. But I think the 20% are just not telling you that they're using them. So there's a lot of research. I explore this in the book, and it's fascinating, the links that you can make with money management.
so many questions on the back of that, but just one side comment. Like when I saw the video of the guy jumping from space, I got very scared because at some point in the middle, it looks like he's losing control. But then by the end, he stabilizes and makes it. It was absolutely amazing. I remember everyone around me was on the phone, looking at it. It's one of those moments where everyone is together just for a few minutes.
And we should give credit to his sports psychologist. His name is Michael Gervais. He publishes great books that are worth reading as well.
Yeah, absolutely amazing. So first question on the back of that, like, do you think there's a specific sport or a type of sport that, it's closer to investing than others?
That's a good question. I talk about this in the book. Roger Federer went viral when he made a commencement speech and he talked about losing and, in a sense, sports psychology. So let's take tennis.
That's such a good speech, by the way.
Investing is a team sport, and there's probably better analogies, but Federer's speech was fascinating because he said, look, as the best tennis players of all time, he's played 1,500 matches, and he's won 80% of those matches. But then he said, and asked rhetorically, what percentage of the points do you think I lost? This is Federer talking. And he lost almost half the points. He only won 54% of the points. So that's a small edge, but a small edge that he repeated throughout his entire career to become one of the greatest tennis players of all time. When I think about investing, if you have a small edge, but a really good process and you can replicate it over time, then you can you can deliver it with skilled active management. I don't really care, Ignacio, about average active management. I think that's kind of not a so interesting statistic, is what can you get from skilled active management that's repeatable, process-based over time? And if it's a small edge, but you can repeat it over time, you'll do well. But the takeaway is you're going to lose. And this is what he said to the students, right? They're all excited, like they're starting their professional lives. And he goes, whatever you do in life, you're going to lose pretty often. And that happens in investing.
Yeah, 100%. It's funny you were talking about tennis because it's one of the sports that I thought you were going to answer. The other one that came to my mind is golf, because I play a lot of golf. And a lot of people don't know this, but golf is like a really, really psychological game. Like I would say the mental aspect of it is more important than the technique, arguably, when you get to a certain level. And I see a lot of parallels also between golf and investing. Namely, you got to have a plan. You got to stick to it whenever things go wrong, because I can 100% guarantee that at some point things are not going to go as you thought they would go. It's impossible to play 18 holes without making a bad shot, and it's impossible to invest without having days where the market corrects. Definitely, I think it's very, very accurate to make a connection between sports and investing. And what are the specific techniques from sports psychology have you found particularly effective in the investment world? Is it visualization? Is it mental rehearsal? Is it performance routines?
The number one thing is to understand and manage your motivation for what you do. There's a lot of research on golf, Ignacio, and sports psychology, because it's very much a mental game. And the sports psychologists differentiate between two types of golfers that have two different motivations. One is ego-driven, and this is a golfer who wants a very low handicap, wants a trophy, and drive a Ferrari and impress others. And by the way, before I go further into this, we all have a bit of ego motivation in ourselves. Let's not just bash the ego motivation. It's there and it's a motivational force. But if you're almost entirely ego motivated as a golf player, when you lose, you're going to suffer and you're not necessarily going to use the opportunity to improve. The second type of golfer that's described in sports psychology is one that is mastery oriented. And with mastery, and let me know if it applies to you, Ignacio. Do you get excited if you get better at your swing? This has nothing to do with the scoreboard, nothing to do with people looking at you making a nice shot. Do you intrinsically get excited by improving your swing? You're out there, you're practicing, and you're like, oh, my swing is getting better. That is a mastery orientation. That is getting excited over getting a better process. I'm going to pause and see, what percentage do you think when you play golf? Because I don't play. I'm really can't play to save my life. But what percentage would you say is ego in your case versus mastery?
I would say it's probably like 70% mastery and 30% ego, but ego in a different way to the one you described. So not necessarily driving the Ferrari and so on, because when you're an amateur, there's no Ferraris whatsoever. But it's more about proving to yourself that you can achieve a certain outcome if you put in the reps. And what I find really, really cool about golf is that all your efforts are crystallized in a single number, which could at times feel a little bit unfair, but there's rarely any other sports where a number really, showcases all the blood and tears and sweat that you've put in there. And in golf, you have handicap. And seeing that number going down after training for hours and hours and hours is just like something very tangible and something really cool. And I'm not going to lie, it's something that I personally look at very closely, but it is not the most important part of the journey, at least for me.
All right. Let's tell our audience what your handicap is.
Oh my God. That's like the worst question that you can ask anyone.
Is it impolite?
Yeah, like
we can skip over it if you don't want.
No. I'm happy. I'm 5.9, which is decent, but I'm hoping to break 5 this year. Hopefully, I go below 5 at 4 point something, and that will be a good season for me.
Awesome. And by the way, metrics and goals and some ego orientation are all part of a high-performing attitude towards what you do. And it's not black or white. It's not ego or mastery. But to the extent you can improve or increase your mastery focus, you're going to have a much better time doing this. And you're going to have a much better time handling a down day in the market or a down day in your portfolio. But let's translate that to finance. We have our metrics, and we are pretty ranking metrics oriented. But at the same time, for example, what I'm trying to do in my organization is always come back to the process and get people excited about having a better process all the time. Are we fostering a culture where the best ideas surface? If not, what can we do? And isn't it exciting to improve our culture in terms of getting the ideas to collide and getting the best thinking into the portfolios? Are we running meetings efficiently? Are we using the right research? Are we allocating our resources for proprietary research in the right way? All those things in investing, they're all mastery. You won't see these effects in the alpha over the next 6 months. But if you can bring your thinking or your organizational thinking around more of a mastery orientation, and don't fool yourself, there's ego everywhere and that's okay, but more of a mastery, tip it 10, 20% more mastery. Longer term, A, you'll have a better time managing money with the ups and downs, and B, you will get better at it than if you just focus on ego goals.
Yeah, 100%. And it's crazy how sometimes the best things happen after asking very, very simple questions. But yeah, so we're talking about handicaps. We're talking about measurable goals. Obviously, working in the finance industry, that's something we love. We live by numbers, right? And measurable goals give you clarity, but they also have a downside, which is they can lead you to what you call goal-induced blindness, where short-term targets overshadow long-term sustainability. So why do you think there are these side effects of measurable goals, and how can we rethink goal setting and attainment in finance to make the whole thing a little bit more healthy? Hey there, quick favor to ask. If you enjoy the blunt dollar, the unfiltered takes, the stories, and the laughs, the easiest way to support the show is by tapping that subscribe button right now while you're listening. And here's my promise. If you do, I'll keep bringing you honest conversations, fresh perspectives, and the kind of finance talk that's engaging, insightful, and worth your time. Thanks so much for being here, and let's keep these great finance conversations going.
Yeah, I love that question because goal-induced blindness goes beyond what you just said and also includes basically losing sight of everything else but your goal. And that means that people will cheat, people will sacrifice their well-being, nothing else matters than your goal. And that is well documented in the psychology literature. It's called goal-induced blindness. And you know what? The best example, the most common example, is the very measurable goal of summiting Everest. And that's the classical psychology research example of what happens when people get goal-induced blindness. I mean, Ignacio, I was just looking into this. We just had one of the deadliest seasons for Everest climbing ever. And nothing special happened. No weather, no storms, nothing, right? So let's do a thought experiment. If I give you a bowl with 100 gummies, and I challenge you to take a gummy and eat one, but you know that 4 of them in the bowl of 100 gummies is going to kill you. So that's the thought experiment. And I'm asking you, how much money would you take in exchange for the challenge of eating one of those gummies, knowing that 4 of them out of 100 will kill you? And, I could say, would you do it for $1 million? Would you do it for $100 million? Would you do it for $1 billion? And this thought experiment, I mean, I don't know. I don't think I would do it, but this is a thought experiment because if you want to summit Everest, your chance of dying is 4%. It's the 4 gummies that can kill you out of 100. And those deaths are not predictable. So that's the classical example is Everest summiting, 4% chance of dying, and people do it because it's such an attractive goal. And they develop, some of them is just bad luck, but some of them, if you read about it, is pure goal-induced blindness. They know they're not going to make it. They lose sight of their oxygen supply or whatever, and they just see the summit. And so we do that in business too. We do that in business. We have these KPIs, these earnings targets. You have all these companies that ended up, Volkswagen cheating on their emissions numbers and testing. Wells Fargo creating dummy accounts, just boosting their account numbers, just to meet some goal, some measurable goal. The stuff Enron was doing and WorldCom and on and on and on and on. So I talk about this and the book is not minimizing ambition and measurable goals. Measurable goals, we send people to the moon with goals. That's the goal, we're going to do it. And you achieve a lot. But you have to expand and add goals on process, on mastery, and add goals that are not measurable, such as fostering a culture of high performance. You can't measure that, but it might be your most important goal because everything else will follow.
I am still thinking about the question of the gummies.
You do it for $1 billion.
I think I'm gonna go to bed tonight. Like, okay, for how much would I actually do this? I don't know. I have to
$1 billion. But for the Everest thing, it's actually pain and suffering, right? But it's just such an irresistible goal.
Yeah, absolutely.
For a lot of climbers.
Yeah, and it must be, heartbreaking being there and knowing, for example, that if you go to the top, you cannot make it back for some sort of technical reason or oxygen in the tanks or things like that.
And by the way, there are people who have, I think the world record is someone summited over 30 times. And those that have multiple summits are the best at quitting. They know exactly when they need to quit.
Yeah.
And that's another skill for leadership that's underrated. Annie Duke has a fantastic book titled Quit. It's such an underrated skill. When you have so much invested in a project, but the market has changed, and the market is moving from mutual funds to ETFs and separately managed account, but you have so much invested behind your mutual fund infrastructure. You need to not quit, but at least be able to pivot some of your resources from A to B. Underrated skill in business. And it's also very much related to psychology of it.
Wouldn't that be what the economists refer to as a sunk cost, really?
Exactly. And that's what Annie Duke talks about in her book. I explore that in mine as well.
So for readers, for listeners, that sunk cost is what basically when you've invested some money, but that you should consider it as lost, and it shouldn't be part of your thinking process anymore, because no matter what the outcome is, that money, you're basically not going to get it back. Is that
it's
kind
gone.
of how it works?
It's gone. And Annie Duke's example is fascinating. It's about the high-speed rail project in California. It's already cost billions. And it's now evident that the projections were completely wrong. And the best decision is probably abandoning the project. And I know there's some political stuff around that project as well, but it's a good example of it's just not going to work. And you have to stop, but it's hard when you say we've already paid $10 billion to start building this rail. But the next 10, 100 billion could be spent somewhere else.
Yeah, obviously we're talking about psychology here and leadership, but this clearly applies every day to investor psychology, and especially when you're losing money on a position. Why? Well, because feelings and emotions influence everything we do in markets, right? And as a result of that, we have stock bubbles, we have panic selling during downturns, and so on. So I think that ties very nicely to my next question for you, which is how can finance professionals apply leadership psychology to manage these emotions, both their own and their clients', particularly during periods of market turbulence?
Look, it's about resilience in managing stress, or if you're financial advisors, helping your clients manage the stress of market drawdowns, which is real. We all have this view that we should drive stress down towards zero. But that's impossible. You will not go through life. In fact, optimal performance does not happen at zero stress. It requires a certain level of stress and activation. So Tim Ferriss wrote, I love this quote, I have it in the book, embracing stress is a superpower. And that is relevant to investing, to counseling clients, to take advantage of difficult moments. For example, to buy equities when they're down 20% instead of panicking and selling equities. We all want zero stress, but and stress will kill you, right? There's the research that shows that stress will kill you. In the book, I talk about the ideal of resilience. I use Neil Armstrong for the first manned moon landing. It's a well-known story, but there's a little background story behind it that's fascinating. So during the first manned moon landing, famously, everything went completely wrong. The communication between the module and Earth did not work. The module veered off course, the computers stopped working, and they were running out of fuel. Armstrong took over and landed the module somewhere else than it was supposed to land. Here's the remarkable thing, Ignacio. He was hooked to a heart rate monitor. His average heart rate during that entire mission was 75, which for a lot of people is actually a resting heart rate. So Neil Armstrong had incredible, being a jet fighter pilot, incredible resilience to stress. And that's kind of the model, and we want to be like that. By the way, his heart rate actually spiked to 150 just when he landed. But then it's very people specific. Other people will have lower resilience to stress. and starting to learn to understand people's resilience to stress and their attitude. And we call this, the psychology researchers call this your level of neuroticism, will really help you build empathy and understand how people react to things. And also going back to embracing stress for yourself, you might realize, Ignacio, if you're playing golf and it's not going well, or if you're in a difficult situation, or if you have an issue with your portfolio in the markets, you might realize that this zero stress, this Neil Armstrong example, is just not possible for you. And here's the trick that you learn from sports psychology. You reframe it as something more akin to activation, motivation, and you embrace it. You accept it. You're not going to live without stress. And when you start doing that, and you learn that from sports psychology, but other areas of research in psychology, you're going to become more resilient. So the bottom line, it's not about this ideal state of zero stress. In fact, if you were never stressed or never anxious about anything, you would not perform as well as you do.
And you wouldn't be alive. I mean, it's part of life.
You would be bored out of your mind. And there's research on flow that shows that. This is also in the research in psychology. If you went through life with zero stress, you would not have a 5.9 golf handicap. You would be bored out of your mind. You would not be motivated. And by the way, if you're going to get surgery, or if you're going to get in a car with a race car driver, or anything similar where there's sort of, you need full attention and skills, you kind of want your surgeon to be a little anxious about what they're about to do. You don't want them to be at zero stress.
Yeah.
So we have to realize that, embrace it, and recognize that it differs by person. We're not all Neil Armstrongs. And also recognize that optimal performance is achieved at a certain level of activation or stress, and that level is different depending on the task. The more complicated tasks, you'll perform better at lower stress level. Archery, you need to concentrate, take a deep breath. The more direct, simple tasks, powerlifting, then you can have very high activation. So sports psychologists call it activation, or the term arousal is used as well. They use that to reframe from stress. Pop psychology would call it stress, but powerlifting, there's no amount of stress you can have that is not actually going to increase your powerlifting performance, right? So it depends on the task. It depends on the people. It's there. The optimal is not zero. If you learn to manage it, you can drive your performance higher and your team's performance higher as well.
It's funny what you were saying about embracing it. I was recently watching this golf documentary on Netflix called Full Swing, and you see a little bit of the behind the scenes of how players approach big tournaments and so on. And if there's one common thing that most of them said is that, obviously Sunday, final day, big tournament, you're in the lead, very stressed if you're going to win a major or something like that. And instead of trying to calm down, they all say that they actually embrace that stress, that fear, and try to use it to fire them up in some way. Because if you try to reject it, it's not going to happen. It's part of human nature. It's impossible to remain oblivious to all the things going around you.
I think that's the key, right? The top athlete, the golfer is making the critical shot. The basketball player needs to make the 3-point shot at the buzzer. They get incredibly stressed and anxious, but they don't beat themselves up over it. Because if you start stressing about stressing, you're adding another layer of it. For the research for the book, I spent a lot of time with a sports psychologist, and he also happens to have 40 national titles in the sport of handball. His name is Dr. Daniel Zimmett. So the sport of handball is kind of like squash, but you whack the ball with your hands. 40 national titles, 40. So he's a sports psychologist. He's mastered his sports mental game in practice as well. And Ignacio told me and he trains top athletes. Every top athlete is high in neuroticism. They get really anxious, and that's part of what motivates them.
Mhm.
But at some point, they stop beating themselves up over it and try to turn it into excitement and motivation and activation.
Yeah. 100%. Use it instead of fighting it. Love it. I want to talk about something else related to what happens in our brains when we're in specific type of situations, which is the concept of flow, which is when someone is fully immersed in an activity and is performing at their highest level, be it in sports, in music, or even in my personal case. I've experienced that many times when I'm programming, for example. Could you tell me a bit about engagement and psychological flow and how finance professionals use this concept to improve focus and how could they use it for their decision making?
For me, it's writing. I used to write some code earlier in my career, so you still code, Ignacio. It is definitely a flow activity because you're just fully engaged and you lose track of time. For me, it's actually writing. There are other activities that will get me in flow, but this dovetails with the prior discussion on stress. And I want to clarify something on stress, and it relates to the psychology of flow. We talk about embracing stress. It's actually an inverted U-shaped curve, and the optimal performance point is at a certain stress level. But beyond that point, it becomes what we all know about stress, unhealthy. And it is bad for you. And you will choke and your performance will go down. So those are called Yerkes-Dodson's curves. They've been studied for decades in psychology and sports psychology. Why I clarify that? Because we were all here just saying embrace stress, embrace stress. If you suffer from anxiety, you don't want to hear that. And, you need to really manage it differently from a clinical perspective. But why does this relate to flow? Flow is an optimal point. It's kind of like those Yerkes-Dodson's curves. Flow is when you're engaged in something and you get immediate or frequent feedback, and the task is matching your skill levels. You're pushing your skills just to meet the difficulty of the task. And below that, you get bored and you're not as productive. Above it, when the task is too difficult, it might be stress or something else, but when the task is too difficult, you're just going to give up. So when the research was done on this years ago, it kind of changed how people think about positive psychology, but they hooked people up to survey, to monitors and to survey data. So they would ask them every 5 minutes for weeks, how do you feel? How do you feel? And then they looked at what they were doing, and that's how they found this definition of flow. The writer who came up with it, the psychologist who came up with it, it's hard to pronounce his name, is Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, I think. I always struggle with the last name. But that's what it's about. And I recall, my first job, Ignacio, was in general building maintenance. I talk about this in the book. And it wasn't a fun job. I was a teenager. I hadn't developed any kind of work ethic, so it was difficult for me. But all day long, all week long, we were doing different tasks in general building maintenance. So I was mowing the lawn, painting apartments. We're going from building to building, scrubbing the parking lots. We went to factories and we had to scrub the ceilings. It was tough. And looking back on it, there's some tasks where time would fly. And there are other tasks where it would be excruciating and I'd just be waiting for the break when we could have our lunch or snack. And if I think about what type of tasks would be engaging and I would lose track of time, those are the tasks where I could see progress in real time. It wasn't necessarily about difficulty or being hard enough. It was just the process of mowing the lawn, for example. I would get lost in it because I could see very clearly how I was making progress. But scrubbing the ceiling of a factory where I know we weren't even making a dent and I couldn't even see the progress, that was not a state of flow. So you can think of flow in that way, but it's much broader. It also applies to organizations. Teams can get in flow. You can get in flow in conversations. I think we're kind of in flow right now because the neurons are firing and we're having a conversation. Think of an orchestra. So there's a team concept to flow that's not as appreciated, I think, in popular culture. And look, at the end of the day, there is an engagement crisis in companies. I don't know if you feel engaged in your work. I'm sure you feel engaged with the podcast. But when the last survey that came out, I have it here, only 23% of employees for a survey responded that they're engaged at work. Only 23, that's like 77% that are either not engaged or actively disengaged. And I think there's something we should think about with flow. Give people more feedback, gamify the work, organize the work in a way that generates a state of mental engagement. It's not that hard, small rewards along the way, smaller milestones, and building relationships too, which is a big, big component. Having positive relationships at work, I think, would increase engagement as well. And again, this concept that you can be in flow when you're in a conversation, that's fascinating, and that's pretty important. Perhaps a key to start increasing engagement at work.
So my answer to the question, especially because I'm pretty sure some of my bosses are listening to this, very engaged at work. Very happy, very, very happy. And I hope to be in the company for many, many more years. But jokes aside, I think what you mentioned about flow not being something that just happened within your brain, but also with other people is fascinating, because I tended to think about flow just, within myself. But now that I think about it, it's also, there's also a romantic side of it, right? And when you find a partner, someone that you love, you get into that state of flow in some way when you talk to that person, because you don't see the time pass. And I never thought about that, what I feel with my wife is that state of flow in some way. So thanks for adding that perspective.
And also at work, sometimes I'm with our leadership team. People are discussing ideas. Maybe we're debating markets. Maybe we're debating business strategy. And I step back and I look at the ideas flying around back and forth, the intellect's fully engaged. And I think, the team is in flow right now. The soccer team is in flow.
Yeah. And if they're not doing that, I guess your role as a manager is to get them there, right? Trying to trigger certain people, asking certain questions and get them going. So you need to have the emotional intelligence to identify the rhythm of the conversation, the levels of flow to get them there. That's pretty cool. So we've talked about the state of flow. We've talked about stress, and intimately related to all of this, obviously, is the concept of rest, I think, also. Especially in finance, right? Because in finance, there's this culture for long hours, early mornings, market obsession, which is often worn as a badge of honor. But research from fields like neuroscience and performance psychology shows that the rest and the recovery processes are very crucial for sustained cognitive functions. Even like hedge fund managers like Ray Dalio have openly discussed like how they use meditation to sharpen their focus. So what have you found about the role of rest and recovery in leadership and investing? Hey there, quick ad break. Do you work in the finance industry and have a genuinely interesting story to share? I'm always on the hunt for great guests who bring raw, unfiltered insights to the table. Or maybe you know someone with a story worth telling? Please put us in touch. You can reach out to me directly via LinkedIn. I'd love to hear from you. And now, back to the show.
I gave this advice to students recently. I had all this career advice for them, but at the end, my last piece of advice was take good care of yourself.
Uh-huh.
And here's the thing for me that clicked. There's 3 things you really need to be mindful of, and no one's perfect, but you need to be mindful of your sleep. You need to be mindful of your diet, and you need to exercise. But the most fascinating part that, as I've applied this to my life, that is really important is none of these work really unless you have all 3 working together. So Ignacio, if you tell me I'm going to exercise 30% more, but I'm not going to change my diet and I'm still going to sleep only 5 hours a night, that's not as good as if you say, I'm going to improve my sleep by 10%, I'm going to improve my diet by 10%, and I'm going to improve my exercise by 10%. Same 30%, say, of your time. But this balance, these 3 things work together. And that's really important for long-term, sustained high performance, whether it's in sports or life or business. If you exercise, you're going to sleep better at night. All else equal, right? You might have other sleep issues. But if you exercise, generally speaking, it's going to help your sleep. When you sleep well, it turns out your hormones and your gut bacteria, they're all in balance. And with good sleep, you actually can control your appetite better. And that actually helps with the diet. That might be a link that a lot of people don't realize. Think about it. If you only slept 2 or 3 hours, you kind of randomly get super hungry. So the sleep helps you control your diet. The sleep and the diet give you energy to exercise. So there's 3 legs of the stool and you can't take one away. Again, no one's perfect, right? And it's not about just losing, again, goal-induced blindness. Don't get goal-induced blindness, but try to find some good balance. That makes a huge difference.
And go back to the basics. I mean, honestly speaking, the most underrated productivity hack in the world is sleeping. Like, people are obsessing about, I don't know, like tweaking little things in a process or in a line of code and so on and so forth. And they would spend hours and hours trying to find. But, like, I can guarantee that just by getting a little bit more sleep, you can make things make things progress a lot more than you could possibly imagine. I read it once from a designer I follow on LinkedIn, and I think it's true. Like, sleeping is the number 1 productivity hack.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a book by Matt Walker out there, Why We Sleep. I refer to his book in my book, In the Psychology of Leadership. But good sleep will improve your entire physical and mental health. Actually be mentally more resilient. You'll be less prone to disease. I mean, it's that simple.
So we're circling around this whole concept of mental health, I feel, and the finance industry has historically been reluctant, I think, to acknowledge mental health struggles. Yet in recent years, firms started addressing the mental toll of high pressure roles, not only managers, but also like all types of employees. I'd argue there's companies now offering in-house therapy and mental resilience programs and things like that. So do you think the finance industry is finally changing its approach to mental health, or is there still some sort of stigma around discussing these challenges?
I think we're making progress. Nikolai Tangen, when he took over the gigantic Norway fund, first thing he did, he hired a sports psychologist to support his investment staff. We have a program like this. You can always call on someone and talk. My book is about positive psychology. It's about sports psychology. And I also have fascinating things about personality psychology. So it's not about the clinical side. And I think the clinical side is incredibly important. But when you start looking at the research, the positive side of psychology is almost as researched as the clinical side. And in removing the stigma as an industry, we just need to focus not ignore mental health issues, right? It's just a whole different thing. So I don't cover mental health in my book. I cover the positive side of psychology, but I think that's a roundabout way that our industry's coming around the positive side of psychology, high performance psychology, right? I told my team yesterday, we're talking about, just improving our presentation skills and doing a training for our teams. And I said, look, don't ever think you're too good to get training or counseling or coaching. The world's top athletes have coaches, and increasingly mental coaches. So I think it's coming to our industry, Ignacio. I think it's easier when you take the positive route to it. Think about the fact that all these baseball teams all have now a sports psychologist on staff. Shouldn't all... and you see this, it's kind of caricatured in some TV shows, that they have a sports psychologist there. I guess there's one in Ted Lasso, for example, but also in some investment TV shows. But I think that's the way. I think we're moving in the right direction. We should approach it as a performance enhancer, while, of course, offering support for mental health, clinical issues, but even in the absence of clinical issues, or maybe in a preventative way so that you don't get into a clinical issue. Think about it as a performance enhancer.
Yeah, 100% agree. And I feel the world is changing the way it looks at this whole thing. People are now realizing that, the same way you bring your car to the garage when there's something going on, or just like once a year to review that everything is working, the same way you go to the fitness room just to exercise and move a little bit. It makes a lot of sense to, hire someone or work with someone to look at what's going on in your brain and your psychological state in general. I think it's definitely a positive trend, and I'm looking forward to see how more and more people start doing this in the future. Really,
I think it can make you a better leader to understand positive psychology. I think it can make you more resilient. And, my entire book, I have 18 principles, but they're all about applying the positive side for better performance, resilience, and leadership. And I have a bunch of stories and some attempts at humor there as well. So it's not just pure research. I tried to make it a fun read. So we'll see how it's received. It's just about to come out.
I'm sure it's going to be fantastic. So you're talking about leadership. Many firms struggle balancing direct constructive criticism from leadership and management with maintaining trust and strong relationships within teams. Can you give some tips about how you see the whole feedback process? And could you explain us how prioritizing relationships has helped you in your work and managing teams in general?
There's one trick that is introduced in the research by Dr. David Rock. He specializes in neuro leadership. And the trick to make feedback easier is to ask for it. And as a leader, you should model that. You should ask for feedback. And it turns out that when people ask for it, the stress of the feedback process goes down. Otherwise, everybody hates it. Everybody hates it. I mean, Ignacio, if I call you after this and I go, can I give you some feedback? Ooh, how's that going to feel? Just that sentence, right?
Yeah.
Can I give you some feedback? It's hard. It's almost like a fight or flight response. But feedback is how you improve. It's important. We all hate it, but it's important. So if you start modeling behaviors and if people get used to asking for it and asking for it in a forward-looking way. So what I should do after the podcast is call you and say, hey, if we do a next one, what should I do better? What could I tweak for the next one? Right? You make it forward-looking. It comes from you.
Constructive.
It's going to be easier for you too to give the feedback. When there's someone asking for feedback, because feedback is hard for the giver, not just for the receiver. Everybody involved hates it. But, it's important. It helps with self-awareness. It's also incredibly biased. oftentimes you receive feedback and it reflects more on the person giving the feedback, their attitudes, their concerns than yours. And so, we all care about what other people think, but we have to develop our own true north, our own values, our own goals, and take some feedback and leave some. It's been hard for me in my career. I take feedback very, very deeply, seriously. But over time, I've had to learn, some of it I should just ignore. Even.
Someone told me about this feedback technique, which I find kind of useful, which is called the sandwich technique. So if I have to give some feedback, particularly when it's something that I know is going to be a little bit hard for the other person to hear, you do this sandwich where you start with something positive, you put the negative, harder part in the middle, and then you wrap up with, again, something positive. And that way the message goes through a little bit better.
I think that genuinely helps. And I've been guilty myself of not using it enough and just firing. And when you reach a certain level in an organization, you have to be really careful because you might not mean something to be too critical, but it's going to maybe ruin someone's week, right? Just because you didn't use the right tone. So it is useful, but it has to be genuine. It has to be genuine. So you have to say something that's genuinely positive about the situation or whatever you're giving feedback on that you believe in. Then give the constructive and then go back. But don't just make it up. And but it's actually a good exercise because you pause and you ask yourself, okay, this team that I'm giving feedback to, they're actually doing really good work overall. Mm-hmm. I'm just annoyed with some failure that just happened here. So, incredibly helpful to sandwich things. I've had my own journey on this. I do it more and more, but you have to do it genuinely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it also depends a lot on the culture. I think some cultures are more direct than others. Americans, I think, are more straightforward. Europeans, Southern Europeans probably are a little bit more indirect. But yeah, it's interesting. And that's a whole different conversation, like maybe for another day, the cultural differences when it comes to management styles and so on. So I have a question about the traditional role models in finance, because we're talking about leadership. I'm assuming a lot of people in the industry perceive you, as a role model, someone that like to emulate in some way. And particularly in finance, I think many investors look at high-profile investors, think of Buffett, Dalio, Soros, all these folks out there as role models. But following blindly these role models can also lead to unrealistic expectations and more importantly, to poor decision making. So what's one common mistake do we make that you've seen when considering role models to guide our work in finance? And most importantly, what can we do to avoid that type of mistake?
I have a little bit of a fascination with billionaires. I've read so many biographies of billionaires, and I talk about billionaires in the book. I talk about their motivation. And the fascinating thing, the more you look into it, is most of them are pretty horrible at relationships. And the study from the longest study on happiness ever made is from Harvard, shows that the number one factor of your long-term happiness is going to be positive relationships. Mm-hmm. So I think there are two mistakes we made. I know you asked me for one. One is we don't realize how much role models influence our thoughts and attitude. It's not just teenagers who want to dress like Taylor Swift. The research shows that in one way or the other, your role models influence your behaviors and attitude probably more than you realize. And the second mistake is just admire people because they've had so much success, ignoring something some of your listeners will quickly grasp, assuming you have quantitative analysts in your audience, ignoring survivorship bias. There's some people who have been really successful because of incredible luck or really odd circumstances or in spite of being horrible at relationships. And the fact that they're being horrible at relationships didn't really, is it the reason why they've been successful? So I think when we pick role models, especially amongst people who have traditional metric of success, we ignore the fact that there may be a million people who took the same kinds of risks, and these weren't the right risks to take, but we're looking at the one survivor, the one who flipped 20 heads in a row. So I think that we make that mistake. So what I do in the book is I talk about my parents and what I admire about each of them. And I had to cut some of it because I was going on a tangent. My editor called and said, go back to leadership. But you find role models, not necessarily amongst billionaires, but people who are really good at relationships, who do really good work, who keep their head down, who have lifelong motivations that are driving how they perform, that are, high achievers by all means, but it's just a different way to think about it. So that's one of the takeaways. There's a lot. There's a lot about, I talk about Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos in one part of the book, where what's your motivation if you have all the money in the world? Like, why do you keep going? It clearly is not money. And I talk about some of it is social comparison. And when they start arguing, this is several years ago, but when they start arguing with each other on Twitter, now called X, about their rockets, and when Bezos wrote a tweet about a self-landing rocket, not giving credit to SpaceX at all for having done that 15 times. So they start arguing back and forth. I have some of that dialogue in the book, but that shows a different motivation for them, right? A social comparison motivation. It can be powerful. It can be used the right way. It can be a good thing, but it's not always. Sometimes, these aren't perfect people by any means.
So I didn't know you had a fascination for billionaires, but I'm going to recommend you a podcast that I absolutely loved from the BBC. It's called Good, Bad Billionaires. And each episode talks about a different billionaire. They cover their story, how they make their money. Some people, you have no clue they're actually billionaires. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, wow. Some people you've never heard about. And at the end, it's funny because they say, is it a good billionaire? Is it a bad billionaire? Or is it just like a neutral? Did they do something good for the world or not? And it's really, really interesting. But yeah, talking about social comparison, do you think, how can finance professionals leverage this social comparison to their advantage? And when does it actually become a risk in your view?
So the research shows that 10% of your thoughts in general, on average, are social comparisons. So you think about how good looking you are, how much money you make, how fast you're running, whatever. So it's part of human nature. And it can get very unhealthy, and it is weaponized, if you will, through social media, where you're getting social comparison through your veins directly. But it also has advantages as a powerful source of motivation. So, Ignacio, I like to run, and there's an intrinsic motivation for me to run. You go outside, it's cold and dark, you're on your own, you're not impressing anybody, and you need to be self-motivated to run. But at the same time, my fastest running times were during races, which are completely organized around social comparison. It's like your handicap score that you like to look at, right? There's a ranking there. There's an implied ranking. And it's not a bad thing. So you can do things like, for example, in our business, I want us to find efficiencies through artificial intelligence. So I can use a little bit of competition, social comparison to make it interesting and to actually make it relevant to our business, and say something like, over the next 3 months, we're running a contest to find the most interesting, productive sources of efficiency leveraging AI. I give my entire team access to the right tools. And we're going to rank the top 3 and celebrate them. So you can position it like in a race, or you can position it as a healthy source of motivation. There's a lot of nuance, Ignacio, around social motivation. It's good, it's bad. There's a lot of nuance about all the psychology concepts that I explore here.
Well, I mean, there's so much stuff. We're getting close to the end of the call, so I have to be very selective with my questions now. But I feel we could talk about this for hours.
I agree.
But I think one of the also implicit concepts when you talk about social comparison is, how you perform against others. And in finance, when I think about that, the first thing that comes to my mind is the power of contrarian thinking. We've all heard Warren Buffett's philosophy of being fearful when others are greedy and so on. I'd like to hear from you, what does it take to be a successful contrarian person in the finance industry, and how can professionals develop independent thinking, generally speaking?
Now we get partly into personality psychology, which we didn't talk about much today. But to be a successful contrarian, you need to have a certain personality trait that allows you to be disagreeable in a good way. So you need to be able to look at things differently and not be worried about what other people think and act contrary to the consensus. Now that sounds obvious and easy, but in practice, it's incredibly difficult.
So just to clarify, disagreeable, how do you define it? Is it just challenging the status quo, asking difficult questions, or what is it exactly?
So there's a personality. We all know extroversion, introversion. That's an example of a personality trait. There's another one called agreeableness. If you're high in agreeableness, you're a people pleaser. It's difficult for you to disagree. And you just like to get along with people and go along. Okay. If you're high in disagreeableness, or if you're low in agreeableness, then you're someone who tends to be skeptical, who's comfortable with confrontation, and so on. So in general, to be a contrarian investor, it's going to be easier for you if you tend to not score too high on agreeableness. You're going to have to be facing your clients, facing the media, facing your colleagues about a decision that you have conviction is, but that's out of consensus. And that's easier to do if you have that personality trait. But at the same time, as I explain in the book, personality traits are not set in stone. Mm-hmm. They're maybe 30, 40% heritable, so part of your genetics, if you will. But they depend on the situation, and you can work on them, which is fascinating when you think about it.
So it has to do a lot with conflict avoidingness. And
exactly. That would be another way of described agreeableness. Are you a people pleaser? And you can go online and take some tests, like take some questions. Those are pretty obvious, but what's interesting is to compare how you score yourself relative to how thousands of other people score themselves. So, Ignacio, I don't know you that well. I don't know if you score high or low in agreeableness. You seem like a fairly agreeable person to me. But you can go online and test it and get a score relative to how others score themselves.
The truth. Another thing to do after this call. I have to think about the gummies, and now I have to think about my level of agreeableness.
I don't think you would do the gummies for any amount of money, right?
Yeah, it's tough when you have kids, even if it's a very small chance. Yeah, I don't think there's any amount of money really you would risk that for. A couple last questions. So one important question, actually, because the reason we're talking today is because we're going to be meeting at the CFA Institute Live, which is the annual event in Chicago. Very excited about that. What are you going to be talking about there, and what are you most excited about this event?
We're going to have a similar discussion. We're going to talk about money management, but with a focus on psychology, leadership. I'm going to prepare some stories to illustrate the concepts. And Ignacio, I can't wait to be there. I love being part of the CFA Institute. It's been part of my engagement with the industry for a couple decades now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's going to be absolutely a blast. If you work in the industry, make sure you come from the 4th till the 7th of May in Chicago. There's going to be above 1,000 professionals. There's going to be panels left and right. There's going to be events every evening. And there's going to be super smart people to talk with like Sébastien. So make sure you come. And maybe to close this conversation, Sébastien, if you had to leave our listeners with one takeaway, one main lesson from your book, and maybe to tease them a little bit to buy the book and read the rest, what would it be?
The initial title for the book was The End in Mind. And this was a nod to Stephen Covey's principle. Stephen Covey famously wrote The 7 Habits of Highly Successful People. It sold 40 million copies. But my one takeaway would be to take a long-term perspective and think about, over that long-term perspective, where you want to be at the end of your project, ultimately the end of your life. And this leads you to question yourself on your goals, your values. I think it makes you more resilient. So that's the one takeaway. As far as a teaser, I talk about in the book a story about, I call him the human piranha on steroids. So buy the book if you want to hear that story. I have plenty of other stories about my own careers, some projects that did not go well and why. I talk about Metallica. I talk about the TV show Succession. I talk about Game of Thrones. There's a lot of hopefully interesting things to read that make the journey with me interesting. And also at the same time, real research behind this. So hopefully people will like it.
I'm sure they will. I can't wait to read it. Sébastien, thank you so much. To all of you, make sure to follow him on socials, LinkedIn namely, if you're not doing so already. And I'll see you in Chicago. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The Blunt Dollar is written, produced, hosted, and edited by me, Ignacio Ramirez. Everything you hear, concept, script, sound design, and production comes straight from my desk, and occasionally my kitchen table. Thank you so much for listening, and join me in the next episode of The Blunt Dollar for more raw, honest finance conversations.